Okay, welcome everybody. This is the second fall 2021 webinar of SCORI. My name is Philip Verschacht. I'm a founding member of the SCORI board, among others. And I'm very happy to see so many people today for this webinar. The webinar is being recorded, and the webinar will be visible eventually on our website, www.scori.net. It's my great pleasure to introduce today Dr. Louis Akenji, the Executive Director of Hot or Cool in Berlin. It's a public interest think tank. And if I am able to read from their website, the mission of Hot or Cool, a public interest think tank that explores the intersection between social sustainability. We bring together researchers and practitioners to facilitate solutions to global problems, etc., etc. So Louis was previously had many functions, among them Director of Sustainable Consumption and Production at IGES, the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies in Japan, and also many other roles as an advisor. I've known Louis, I think, since 2012, a Rio Plus 20 conference where the Global Research Forum organized a first workshop. Since then, we have worked together on many issues, among them a special volume of the Journal of Cleaner Production on sustainable consumption in cities, and most recently at the Graz conference of the IRSCP in Graz, we had some very interesting discussion. Louis is a tireless leader in promoting sustainable lifestyles as a systemic issue, and thank you for your interest in giving this seminar, this webinar to SCORI. Just for the household, you can write your questions in the chat box, and after the presentations, I will give you the floor to ask your question in person if you want to do that. Louis, the floor is yours. Please share your screen.
Thank you so much, Philip. This is usually the challenging part, getting the screen to work. Can you see it?
Yes.
All right, wonderful. Oh, that went easily this time. I see so many wonderful names, and so thank you so much for joining. Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. I feel like a bit like prefacing this by saying, I just came back from the COP, which without putting any spin to it, it still rubs pretty raw right now. I think the fossil fuel industry came to town and took us for a ride, and you can see it from the outcome. Because this is still raw. If you're here to suggest that maybe climate change is not man-made, then I would suggest that I don't really have the appetite for that today, or that consumption-based accounting is a trick by businesses. Then perhaps you might want to visit another, webinar, not this one. That said, from the names I've seen and the highly respected persons that are present here, I'm hoping we can have a really decent conversation about people and the future. And in fact, the failure of the COP, or the lack of success at the COP, maybe I should put it that way, is just a very strong indication of why the lifestyle angle becomes so much more pertinent, and why some form of active engagement from citizens would be especially important if we want to keep 1.5 alive, as they say. It is important to recognize that at the center of this report, really, it's about people, and all the net zero promises that are being made by national governments, the agreements on circular economy. Where are people's aspirations? How would they affect people? How would they affect people in different regions? And how would people in turn sort of shape these directions? The 1.5 degree lifestyles report came out just last month, I would say, and we've received quite a lot of coverage in the media and so on. Why is it different? We just asked the question of what are people's contributions to climate change, or how can changes in lifestyles potentially contribute to solutions? The figure you see is one that you would often see when you get IPCC discussions. It shows which country emits the most. And some countries, you see China, of course, the US, you see India, but some countries you have to look very carefully to see Canada, because although from landmass it's quite big, it's only so small in terms of overall territorial emissions. And that is just the point here. This shows what happens, emissions within the country, but it does not show emissions of products that are abroad, but that are consumed within the country. So order made in China is not included when you look at this. This might be a little bit more representative of the situation where you look at consumption-based accounting, or where you look at per capita emissions, so the population and the emissions per person. In the report, we look at consumption, we use consumption-based accounting to try to understand lifestyles, because this gives a better proxy for the impacts of lifestyles on climate change. What the recent IPCC report tells us is that we have a budget for the next 10 years to emit at current rates. If we want to stay below 1.5, we need to peak by the middle of the century and start decreasing emissions really, really fast. From the literature, we know that about 72% of greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to household consumption and lifestyles. So the unit we use in this report, in the 1.5 degree lifestyles report, is lifestyles carbon footprints. And these include indirect and embedded emissions from household consumption and lifestyles, but do not include emissions from government expenditure and capital formation, for example. So this really comes as close as possible to impacts of lifestyles. What we see is we're currently at a global level, at a global average level, at about 4.6 tons of CO2 emission equivalent per person per year. And if we factor in that we need to get to 1.5, or we need to stay below 1.5, as the IPCC says, our lifestyle carbon footprint should go down to 0.7 tons per person per year. And in between that, the next one is 2030, we should have an intermediary target of about 2.5 tons CO2 equivalent per person per year. Of course, this differs depending on the country, and I will show you the countries that we analyzed in the report. This includes Canada, Finland, the United Kingdom, Japan, China, South Africa, Turkey, Brazil, India, and Indonesia. We analyze these countries to understand the hotspots in these countries, but also to start looking at these variations in how lifestyles in different contexts impact the climate differently. The picture that comes across very clearly is that the highly industrialized countries have per capita much more than developing economies, so to say. And just to look at certain details, the footprint for someone who lives in Canada just from transportation is bigger than the entire footprint from 6 domains of someone who lives in Turkey or someone who lives in South Africa, right? Or if you're taking just transport in Finland, for example, the footprint of personal transport for someone who lives in Finland is bigger than the entire footprint of someone who lives in India. These disparities become very clear once you go through the different domains: food, housing, transportation, consumer goods, leisure, and services. And just to indicate where the rate of reductions that is needed, what it tells us very clearly is that highly industrialized countries are looking at upwards of 80% and up to 95% reductions in emissions of lifestyle carbon footprints by 2050. But it's not only the industrialized countries that need to reduce their emissions. Countries that are still developing, like India and China and Indonesia, that still have hundreds of millions of people to get out of poverty to meet their basic needs, already need to consider reductions by 2050. And we know that there is a need for increased consumption in these countries. What this picture summary tells us is that a planned transition rather than a chaotic transition would help us tame some of the more nasty elements of our society. It is perhaps worth looking at a few of the details that we analyzed in the report. So, the car culture, this is why it's really infuriating understanding what the fossil fuel industry is doing to the climate agenda. Cars are by far the biggest contributors of greenhouse gas emissions from a lifestyles perspective. And you can see how they vary across countries. Canada and the US, for example, would be car culture. So it's Finland. But it's not just because people own cars. It's a combination of the ownership of cars and how much the cars are used and the fuel that is used in powering the cars, right? So we know from the analysis that the average Canadian travels about 22,000 kilometers per year. That compared to the average Japanese who travels about half that amount, 11,000 kilometers per year, or someone from the UK who travels about 15,000 kilometers per year. So you can already see that distances impact how much people travel. In addition to these distances, the type of fuel used also determines how impactful this is. And we know that most people travel in their cars alone, and shared mobility services are not really very popular in quite a number of these countries. One of the few examples where public transportation is really making a difference is Japan, for example, where 33% of transport use is public transportation. And of this 33%, it is by train. If you compare this to Canada, public transport use is just about 15%, and trains are 0.5%. That is the difference we are looking at here. Or you could look at housing, which is one of the second highest actually, especially the impact coming from heating and cooling of living space. The reason why the rich countries typically see higher impacts here, of course, is because heating and cooling heating during the winter, for example. But it's also because of living spaces. So the average Canadian has a per capita a living space of about 58 square meters per person, while a Japanese would have about 40 square meters per person. And someone from India has just 10 square meters. This is the disparity we're looking at here. So that combination of the size of living space for the average Canadian and the intensity of the energy that is used for heating really does give a huge impact. About 90% of the renewable energy in the electricity grid for Canada, for example, is hydropower. But this is a bit tricky because just hearing hydropower suddenly gives you the sense that it's renewable. But about 40% of this hydropower is actually pumped hydro. And pumped hydro is a particularly inefficient form of energy. And in some cases, it's actually net negative energy. So we're wasting energy to produce energy, if you will put it in other ways. If you would compare the high energy consuming countries to, let's say, Finland, which is equally very cold, what you realize here is while Finland is also cold and needs a lot of heating, district heating in Finland has ensured that per capita energy consumption is so much lower than you would have for places like Canada. And in the UK, natural gas, I don't know why they ever call it natural gas, which almost sounds like a green gas, but it's not. It's fossil fuel based. It's the primary way of heating homes in the winter. We have similar analysis for food. You can see how much impact meat consumption and meat and dairy has on the climate. It is the reason why people just easily say shifting to plant-based diets. It's one of the easiest things you can do in terms of being nicer to the environment. One thing we do in the report is to try to understand scenarios that would help countries find pathways towards the 2030 target. We look at all the 10 countries. In this case, you're looking at the United Kingdom. The current footprint for the UK is about 8.5 tons per person per year. And the target of 2.5 tons by 2030, we look at two different scenarios of how you could possibly get to this target. One of them is focused really on behavior change. That's scenario A, or the consumption focused scenario. Here, most changes are in behavior, but you also have some changes in the system. But scenario B prioritizes systems change, where you get lots of changes in the system, but just a little bit of change in people's behavior or consumption amount. What we notice in almost all, actually in all the countries, is that it is not either or. It is not systems change or behavior change. There's no country where you can get there without having both. So the whole idea of whether it's systems change or behavior change that is needed is really just a false dichotomy. There are a number of things in this report that I think I would like to highlight that would also give a bit of help in understanding the numbers and perhaps beginning to indicate where solutions could come from. The first one is really understanding the disparities in consumption here. The richest 10% globally are responsible for about 50% of lifestyles, of greenhouse gas emissions from lifestyles. In case you're wondering who the richest 50%, the richest 10% are, if your salary is more than $4,000 a month, you should consider yourself a part of this global elite, right? And no wonder, you know, the strongest delegation, if you would put it that way, in Glasgow was the youth delegation. They had read the science, they came prepared with facts, they were angry, they were loud, they had very clear positions and solutions that they put on the table. We didn't listen to them, of course, which is why the document is the way it is now, but it still doesn't take away that they have such a deep understanding of what the science is saying and the practical approaches that are needed to get this problem dealt with. And as things become even more difficult, we'll be seeing more and more of this type of protests and interventions and social tensions manifesting in society, which is why in the report we ask the question, in a climate emergency, which is also coupled with vast inequalities that we see in society, how do we allocate the remaining carbon budget that we have in a way that is fair and equitable and that allows everyone a sort of opportunity to meet their basic needs and operate in society? We themed the 1.5 degree lifestyles report a fair consumption space, and this diagram explains a little bit of why. The consumption domains we look at are housing, mobility, housing, personal transport, leisure, services, food, and consumer goods, as you would see in the middle of this diagram. The question is how much space we have to negotiate these needs within the carbon budget that we have. Above this, we have overconsumption, and we've already established that the environmental maxima or the ceiling here is 0.7 tons per person per year by 2050. So that's the ceiling we have. But it's not only the rich people that are living unsustainably. It is also people that are under-consuming, people that cannot yet meet their basic needs or operate dignified lives in society. And so there is, from a fair consumption space perspective, a social minima or a floor below which, in a fair society, people should not be allowed to fall. And these people would need to increase their consumption. The question is how within this fair consumption space, we balance how we meet our needs and those vast differences, those countries that are bigger or colder or warmer and need more energy. How do we balance those needs with countries where, you know, they also need to meet their need for food and sanitation and so on. So there is a lot to be reconciled in getting towards the 1.5 in a fair way. One thing that we take up in the report, this is just one of the main policy approaches that we take up in the report, is choice editing. And really the question is whether we're ready to accept limits, because as the report shows, and as the IPCC report shows, or almost any analysis that you would look at on climate change these days, there are limits to consumption, and nature is not negotiating with us on those. So we need to give up certain things, and the sooner we give them up, the better, rather than later. And we need to start finding alternative satisfiers to those things. Choice editing is something that is not entirely new, although it's not always called that. Government's role, you would argue, is essentially about choice editing. It edits out some of the harmful things. This is why you can't buy guns, well, at least in Europe, if you walk into a shop, or drugs or hard drugs, right? Because these have been edited out. The point is governments have typically used traditional approaches such as public safety and health to conduct this editing. But we argue in the report that in a climate emergency, sustainability criteria needs to be incorporated in government's role in choice editing. And we'll go through quite a few of them, which I'll touch upon here. One of them is severely restricting sort of high carbon intensive options, especially where privatized benefits have sort of distributed burdens. So typical examples would be private jets, mega yachts, and the toys of the super rich. But it's not only the super rich. There's also a need to remove the incentives that increase consumerism for most people. For example, frequent flyer miles, which you get rewarded for flying a lot, or loyalty programs for hotels, or advertising that skews things, or planned obsolescence. All these things need to be edited out. But we also need to talk about extremes of poverty and wealth. How really rich can you get to have well-being in life? Can we cap it somewhere that once you get to 99,999,000, everything else that you make goes into supporting the commons or into a public trust? Should we talk about limits to how much people are allowed to get rich off the back of nature and the taxes of others? And we need to start removing sort of very basic needs from the jurisdiction of speculators or speculative investments. Things such as housing, prices are going off the roof. Housing or food should really not be play areas for investors. Right? And start rethinking taxes for harmful investments, such as the heavily taxing investments in fossil fuels, and rethinking infrastructure lock-in. So much is being spent on maintaining roads for private car use. And most of this space could have been used for public services, for parks, for play areas that have lower intensity and that increase the well-being of people. And of course, it's not just about editing out, it's also about editing in. How do we get a top runner approach for social innovation and for business innovation that makes sure alternative satisfiers are coming into society to support this transition or new ways of meeting needs? I will touch on a few examples that do not necessarily just touch on lifestyles, but that have implications on lifestyles. And you can see choice editing in action, for example. The Welsh government just recently announced that it is looking at suspending of future road building plans. Why? Because they look at their emissions from transportation and they're quite substantial. And they realize that by editing out private car use, fossil fuel private car use in the country, it would actually help them in reducing emissions, and they can actually save some money, which they will use to invest in public services. The Dutch government has announced about a 30% reduction, or is proposing 30% reduction in livestock numbers, primarily because of emissions from raising animals. This, of course, is from recognition of the impact of meat consumption, and it will have impacts on meat consumption. And last but not least, lots of countries are talking about banning fossil fuel and further investment. By cutting away some of these things upstream, it takes away the opportunity for them to come into the market and for people's lifestyles to be inefficient. The last few points I'd like to make and really emphasize is the need to understand lifestyles from a much broader perspective than just consumer choice. People live every day not as consumers, but as citizens. And people get up every day trying to live their lives, not thinking of whether they want to wreck the environment or not. There are lots of factors that influence the choices that they make. Some of these are within their control. Some of these are outside of their control. And if you think of it, if you think the impacts of lifestyles are just from consumer choices, then you misread the context or the socio-technical context that informs consumption. So from this diagram, you would see at the very center, the basic needs and desires that we strive to meet through consumption. So for affection, creation, participation, health, identity, protection, and subsistence. So we all have these needs. How we go about them or how we consume is in a sense determined by the second layer out there, which is your personal situation. So your income, we've already discussed this, your gender, your physical ability, your level of education, your peers, and your age. These all influence how or what you consume. The third, which you have even less control over, is the socio-technical conditions that inform a lot of the choices that you have. So the messages from the media, the politics of the country, the policy, the infrastructure that is available or not available, and the economy. All of this sort of predetermine what choices are available to you, and in a sense, influence how you the portfolio that you can pick from. And of course, they're also coordinated to the planetary boundaries, if you would. The three things that you can cluster these into that tell you should be in place if you're a policymaker are the attitudes, these determinants, the attitudes, facilitators, and infrastructure. We talk a lot about the attitude behavior gap. It is because we focus so much on awareness raising, and then we ask the question of why there's so much awareness of this issue, and yet we don't see enough action. That is because we don't have the facilitators that translate this awareness into action. We don't have the right policies or the right prices, or the options are not attractive or easily accessible. So there's the absence of facilitators. And the third element that is very essential here is the presence of infrastructure itself. You will not consume renewable energy if it is not available, or you will not use public transportation if it is not available. So we need to make sure that these three things are in place if we're talking about a transition. I will, if I have a few minutes, I'll quickly reflect since I'm talking to Scott here. And there are a few things that are not fully covered in this report, which I think could be really very important. The first thing is that a number of countries covered are very few, and we're talking, we need to look at a few more countries. So it's possible to work with Scott to start looking at many more countries than we currently have in the report. And the problem also is that, you know, we use averages, country averages in the report, which doesn't really tell the truth. If you take the United States, for example, at some point, 40 billion households were filing for bankruptcy, while the wealth of billionaires during the same time in the pandemic and the lockdown went up by $500 billion. This is the perversion you have in one country, which averages cannot really capture. So we need to set up a more detailed analysis. We also look at this at a national level, but I think there's a lot of work happening in neighborhoods, in cities, and scales that can be much better harnessed and analyzed and solutions introduced than necessarily at national level.
No.
I like you too, Elena. I don't know what it is that you didn't like in the intervention. The focus of the report really, what it leads to is lots of conclusions about reductions. But reductions can also be a bit overwhelming. So we need to look at things like shifts in values and cultural interventions that make it much more acceptable, and that allow for an emergence of different ways, not just of physical consumption, but different ways of understanding and viewing how we go about meeting our needs. Last but not the least, just because we use a climate perspective doesn't mean it's the only approach that can be used in analyzing the impacts of lifestyles and consumption. There's also biodiversity, there's resource use, and all of these are equally important. But they would give you similar messages or conclusions. Bottom line being, there's so much work to be done around this area, and I hope we can find more opportunity to actually build on this. Thank you so very much for this, and sorry for rushing through. I hope we can have some kind of a discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Louis, and thank you for all this great work that you and your institute have been doing. So the floor is open for questions and comments. Maybe Deepti Mahayan, you had a question. Maybe you want to pose it yourself in speech, otherwise you can read it.
Yeah, hi Louis, thank you for the very nice presentation. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, I can hear
Okay.
you.
So so you've given a lot of scenarios which could help, a lot of solutions which would help. From your personal experience, what is that one probably the lowest hanging fruit that would, in lifestyles, but not in system changes, that I'm asking, in lifestyles, personal, individual lifestyles, that could help, that could be applied all across the world?
All right, that
makes sense.
That's a very tricky question. Yes, it of course it makes sense, and it's usually easy to just pick one and say this is the one thing that people can do. Before I answer that, I would like to say again that a lot of this is context dependent, and I could put it first in terms of food. Going vegetarian is really one major change that you can make that would be extremely useful, and not having a car. But I can see how this will create lots of people coming after me after this. But you asked, and there you go. That is the answer.
Alina.
Thank you.
And please write something in the chat box. That's the easiest for me to identify if you want to ask a question. I cannot see everybody. Alina?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Lois, for this really cogent way of presenting the issue. I'd like to hear your observation from Glasgow. I wrote about it recently on Listserv. The impression I had when I listened to what people on the street were saying, the demonstrators, the angry, young and old people who demanded action from the governments. I did not hear, when the microphone was in front of the faces, I did not hear anybody say, I demand that the government help me lead a more sustainable lifestyle. They demanded, in a more vague way, action, and of course, phasing out fossil fuels and so on. But I did not hear the personalization of the sense of responsibility. Who has the responsibility? And your analysis very well shows it's the individual and it's the system. But I did not hear it. What can you tell us? You were there. You listened to these people.
You've essentially just declared that I was a failure because I was at the COP in Glasgow, which is fair enough, Helena. If you don't mind, I would like to make a few comments on Glasgow before I directly respond to your question. Something I noticed in Glasgow this time, which is a bit unusual, and people might not have necessarily expected to hear me say this, is the amount of commitment that some of the negotiators from the member states had. It was incredible and very heartwarming to see members of delegations actually arguing out such solid points and with driving for so much ambition and still getting thwarted. So there is a whole lot of frustration, not in the typical sense of what you would expect that, well, governments just went there to sign off on a really bad resolution. But what this tells is very clearly, the interest groups are very highly active. Something is capturing our national governments from representing our interests. And somehow we need to get to this. That's the one thing. I'm gonna leave it open to your own guess what that could or could not be. This, of course, is the youth as well. The youth were extremely strong and vocal, and it was mostly the youth that had this lifestyle perspective because they feel the immediacy of it, the eco-anxiety that you could get, but also the sort of joie de vivre that they bring to the protest, not necessarily to cheapen the fear or the anxiety that they have, but also to show that they can bring a certain celebration and drum up some noise to get their points across. It was probably one of the better days I had at the COP joining the demonstration, and to see such a degree of solidarity among people, and all these differences between North and South disappearing, youth and non-youth disappearing, all of this just really merged into one powerful demand for a better tomorrow for everybody. And I thought the lifestyle angle was really powerful there. Two things that got worrisome from the lifestyles, from a lifestyle of future society perspective, which might seem initially as good things. a consortium of companies came together, which together have assets worth about $130 trillion. And this was being celebrated. And by all means, there's a lot of good in there, but it's not all about good. This money is locked into a dirty economy, or this money is locked into an economic system that is exacerbating differences in society, that is creating inequalities. It is in the hands of investors that are already rich or have pathways to riches. And it is just going to lock us into the same perverse system that we're seeing now. Nobody is talking about the impact of adding trillions of dollars into an economy without taking out the dollars that are already in dirty areas. So the size of the economy globally is already way too big for the planet to handle. And we're putting in more without taking out the bad elements. That's the first one. The second thing is the role of technology. So much of the discussion around there was technology, either investments in technology or other forms of getting to net zero. There was hardly any real discussion about reductions in consumption. And this is something that needs to be on the table. We need to put it up in very clear wording. We need high consuming societies to reduce the amount of consumption, not just the intensity, the amount of consumption. I think that was part of the answer also, Halina, but it was coded, so we really
Can you mute yourself if you're not speaking, please?
But can you clarify one more thing? This is a great answer, but one more thing. If you presented to these young people, the young people who worry about the future and who get it, the results of your analysis, young Canadians, and tell them you need to reduce your living space by 2/3 in your future life as you are building it, what will be their response to that?
Well, I am not sure about what their response would be, but there are clear indications. We've created an economic momentum that has just driven everything and locked everyone into very uncomfortable positions. So even the average Canadian that wants to reduce their living space to 40 square meters might not even be able to afford a house in Toronto, because the investors have raised the prices. And so I think the intersection of these issues is really not being discussed well enough. That there are additional pressures that don't even allow people to consider the sustainability criteria when they're making these decisions, even when they know that they'll get locked into a housing where the energy source is unsustainable or the heating costs are really high. The fact that it is within their affordability at that stage is a primary driver of why they would get it over other things. So there's, in one sense, reason to sort of speak to people and expect people to make changes. But there's also the need to recognize just how much we are locked into a very perverse system, and that we need to start talking about very openly. Capitalism is not going to get us out of here. Digging even deeper into capitalism is not going to get us out of here. We need to stop, look back, and rethink the values we have as a global community and where we are putting our investments in the future.
Okay, thank you very much, Louis. I have a whole list of speakers. First, we have Annika. Why not conduct a survey among policymakers about what kind of information like this that they need? You want to speak on that? And then we have Hedda and Kat and Patrick lined up here.
Yeah. Yes. Can you see me now? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Well, my first question is about, thank you for all your nice graphs and presentations. What I'm thinking about, if we or any researchers are going to make more studies like this, maybe it would be good to define the target groups of the research beforehand. For example, if it's policymakers have to change the environment surrounding consumers in order for them to make a change. Maybe it would be a good idea to make a survey or interviews among policymakers about what kind of information they would find the most useful from the researchers in order to make a change. That's a suggestion. I also have another idea for maybe something that can be discussed in the SCORI context. One of the low-hanging fruits for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from consumption, as you pointed out, and there is a lot of research about it, is going plant-based, skipping meat and dairy and eating plant-based foods. And it also has some very good and well-documented health benefits, but it's still not happening. And I think it would be really interesting to make an international study about what inhibits this transition, you know, everything from subsidies to policies, to lobbying groups, to availability, to attitudes, just to try to list what inhibits a transition to plant-based foods, because that's a very low-hanging fruit, because in the Western countries, vegetarian option or vegan option are available, both in the shops and I think in most Western countries now you can sort of eat vegan or vegetarian if you want to, and it doesn't cost you anymore either. So I'm really interested in what is it that, why doesn't this change happens when it's better for the environment and it's also more healthy? And I would be really interested to have some international comparison about the situation in the different different countries about that.
Thank you,
Is there
Annika.
something you want? Yeah.
So, Louis, you want to
No,
comment?
I can only agree with the 2 points that you've made. Understanding what information policymakers need, and also understanding what could be slowing down these changes in behavior. On the point about policymakers, those of you who are political economists would understand the importance of understanding power dynamics in the system. And so it's sometimes not just about the information that is needed, it's about who has the influence, what instruments they're using, and how they're influencing decision making. And until this becomes clearer, what came out of the COP is very clear, that decision making is not purely in the hands of the policymakers that went there to negotiate. The power dynamics are a lot more complicated. And I say this with a lot of sympathy for some wonderful government representatives that I saw there from countries that you would not even expect. And of course, from very dirty delegations that were out there to water things down, but that's a given.
Thank you, Louis. So yeah, this is quite an agenda, but I want to give the floor to Hedda now. Hedda Roberts.
Hi there. Thank you so much for your presentation, Lewis. It was very, very interesting. Personally, I'm quite interested in the work of Chinandra Nair and his book on consumptionomics. And I just wondered how much your projections are kind of based on current views of consumption versus what the world might look like in 2030 with 3 billion new middle class consumers from emerging economies, and how we can kind of put sustainable consumption on the international agenda for all countries to have it as a goal to work towards, rather than maybe only centering the narrative on rich countries, which in terms of population numbers might not solve the problem.
So a couple of things which I think would be quite important. If we're talking about a climate emergency and we need to identify where to dial down as soon as possible, I would not want to mince words with this. Those of us in high consuming countries need to face it. We need to reduce our consumption. We could talk about population, we can talk about developing countries, we can talk about all of that. But those of us in high consuming countries, we need to dial down on our consumption. So I don't want this message getting lost in the follow-up answer that I give. There's a lot of analysis that is looking at intensity of consumption or impact of consumption per capita across countries, including the one that I've just presented. And what you see is that the per capita consumption is really, really very low. So if you want to look at it as a joint agenda with the Global South, it is looking at how to increase your own consumption without necessarily triggering the tipping points that we now know from the planetary boundaries, as Johan Rockström would say. there is, to sort of come back to how the IPCC looks at this, of course, from a territorial perspective, there's a lot of emissions that is happening in China, for example, and India. These people need to get energy for their populations and so on. There's also the problem that it is fossil fuel based and the refusal to give that up, or at least part of the negotiation is to get support to give that up. I'm not going to get distracted by that. The point here being, it doesn't become a very fruitful conversation if we're considering that the current level of consumption in those countries should also be the same level in 2030 or 2050, because that's not acceptable, especially with the amount of underconsumption that is going on there right now. So there's need for recognition of the need to increase consumption, but then to question, how do we increase this consumption in a way that has the least intensity on the climate, on land use, and on biodiversity. And I think the point that Chandran makes very, very carefully is that the sort of consumption that is being that is facing this country is not a consumption that is even relevant for them. It's a sort of Western defined consumerism that is being brought over to India and China without it even meeting their own needs. It's only creating disparities, creating discontent, and using up resources and fueling so much tension without even meeting the needs of the people. It's more about the kind of consumption or consumerism that Chandran is quite concerned about. And I think from this perspective, again, going back to rethink the role of technologies, of markets, and so on is really quite important. If we do not establish a value system that recognizes differences in cultures, differences in perspectives, or at least even differences in appetites, then we're going to get a uniformly defined world with a lot of dissatisfaction. There is no way you and I or anyone else sitting in an industrialized country now can promise that every citizen in Africa or in Asia will have the same level of material consumption as citizens of Norway or North America on average in 2050. We just cannot make such a guarantee. And yet we continue to negotiate as if that is possible. It is not. Well, I
Thank
see.
you.
Philip, you're muted, or maybe Helena muted you.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I lost my internet connection, so I didn't see the last part of your answer. I think that Kat has the next question. Kat Atchison.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Lewis, very much for a really brilliant presentation about this really fascinating report. And yeah, I guess I kind of put my response to Helena's question in the chat already, but just yeah, in direct response really to what Helena was saying about why aren't more activists in protests at COP26 talking directly about consumption-based emissions and urging governments to make it easier for us to live more sustainable lifestyles. I just thought I'd share a kind of personal response to that, because I spent quite a lot of time with protesters during COP26 and kind of attended many protests organized by Fridays for Future and things like that. And you know, I think the way I would see it, these questions are not kind of totally separate questions. I think the question of, you know, unsustainable consumption, it's more about sort of taking that back to its systemic roots. So I think a lot of the focus of the protests was very much on capitalism and colonialism and environmental racism, and basically like the fact that the high consumption lifestyles in the global north are sort of sustained by this disregard for the impact that will have on people in the global south and on indigenous communities who are being kind of displaced and harmed by extractive capitalism and all the systems that go into the way we consume. And I think, you know, from a strategic level, I think it's really important to target those very overarching systemic factors, because that's been kind of left out of conversations in climate action sort of in recent years. I think, you know, from my perspective, as like I've been involved in environmental campaigns around behavior change and things like that. And I think young people are really, really aware that like, it's not all about like individual lifestyle change. You have to kind of connect that up to these bigger systemic factors. So I think these aren't kind of separate conversations, but for me, you know, a lot of the momentum from the grassroots level and from the youth protesters is about, well, let's just like take this back to its kind of ideological systemic root, rather than saying we want to talk about smashing capitalism, but we're not going to talk about, you know, consumption-based emissions. It's more about connecting all the dots. And maybe there's a fair point in there that maybe those connections aren't being made clear enough. But yeah, I mean, I guess I just thought I would throw in my perspective in response to that. And yeah, I think Lewis was kind of, yeah, you were kind of conveying this in your answer anyway. I hope that was clear. Sorry if that was a bit rambling.
No, thank you.
Lewis?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I agree with her.
Okay, thank you very much, Kat. So, Patrick, Jeffrey?
Yes, hi to everyone. Thanks for the interesting presentation. So I'm currently looking at the research landscape in a thesis project, and so it's quite interesting to see. Just to follow up on what was just being discussed, what I find, the major challenge is, you know, it's obvious that high income consumption will have to be reduced, but how do we communicate that in ways which don't create, you know, the backlash that certain actors actually want? So it's often been criticized that Fridays for Future and such movements are actually more comprised of high income people than low income people. At least that's my German perspective. So you know, I just wanted to get maybe Louis' thoughts on how do we, you know, communicate, especially towards those who are skeptical, to change towards the alternatives as soon as they're in place, hopefully. So yeah.
So this is also part of the question that we've been asking ourselves since the first 1.5 report, and the European Commission has actually been is now supporting two related projects, Horizon 2020 projects. One of them is EU 1.5 degree lifestyles, that is trying to understand this, exactly what I've presented, but from an EU perspective. But that also engages citizens in sort of in understanding the barriers to action and co-creation of solutions. The other one is PS Lifestyles, which is led by Citra. It's also looking at a similar thing across different countries in Europe. The understanding is how to get data for what people are interested in doing, and how to formulate potential solutions in keeping with what people are comfortable with or their habits and so on. The point I'm trying to make is there's a lot of exploration of this question of exactly how to communicate this topic. But as a few persons in here would recognize, one of the things that came out when the IPCC report came out recently is people going, it's a shock, it's code red and all of this. Actually, it is not. It's bad communication for decades. They've been saying these things for decades, and people are not listening. Just because in a policy document, it suddenly includes the word irrevocable, people are up in arms as if they had not heard this before. Part of the point here is why we're looking for ways to communicate in a sense that doesn't overwhelm or drown people or make them inactive. We also need to start getting very honest about what the science shows and put it out there. We cannot treat or infantilize the public the same way that we're complaining about policymakers or politicians having infantilized us. We need to get a little bit more rigorous about this. Having said that, I'm going to come back and give you an example of a project that we're working on that might be of interest to you. It's called the Beacon for Sustainable Living. We're doing it together with colleagues from One Earth Canada. I can send you a link to it. And it's exactly thinking of how to frame this idea of sustainable lifestyles in a way that it brings opportunities, it becomes actionable, and it allows people to get involved. A few of them I've already mentioned here. One of it is that we talk a lot about reductions, and each time people hear reductions, it just triggers something in them. we need to shift and start looking at regeneration and opportunities for alternative satisfiers, right? We talk a lot about just raising awareness of people, but we need to start complementing this information dissemination with actionable tools and avenues and so on. I would easily argue that if in 2021 you're doing research on willingness to pay for sustainable products, then you're dialing us back to 1990. That has been done and established, and we've seen a huge attitude behavior gap. So if you're supervising anyone here and they submit their thesis to you about willingness to pay, beg them for the sake of humanity to drop it. In an emergency, that doesn't have any role right now, right? So we need to, sorry, I'm being too upfront in this call. I really shouldn't, but there's a certain, we bear a certain responsibility for having mismanaged the knowledge in this field over the last decades and not facing it with a certain degree of honesty, either to policymakers or to citizens that we talk to or governments that we advise, just because we make assumptions that as researchers, this knowledge is too much or it's too heavy or it's too overwhelming. It is not, and it's not our judgment to make anyway. That's my view of it.
Who wants to comment on this?
I'm sorry?
I said, who wants to comment? Who's the next question or comment at this point? And I have to apologize, my internet connection broke. And here we have Liridona Sopiani. You want to speak up, Liridona?
Yes, thank you very much. I joined rather late, but I guess in the very good time. I just wanted to comment on this last statement that you made, Lewis, that we really haven't taken so much responsibility in disseminating the research results. And I myself am a researcher in Sweden. I'm working with like everyday life changes through design. And while this year doing fieldwork research across the entire public housing in Sweden for mobility transition, I saw how much people are not even aware of what we are doing and what we are aiming to reach within the 1.5 degree lifestyle changes. I think that is quite disparate and separate from people's everyday life. And so I just wanted to highlight that as well, that I've observed it firsthand.
You want to comment on that, Lewis?
Well, there are two things that are coming out here. It's also, even in our attempts to get out the information, the angles that get picked up are more sensitization than really giving helpful information. One example is the report. When this report came out, it was picked up by the Times, the BBC, and so on. The angle that people are most interested in exploring is the angle of the super rich. I mean, this is fine. It's a real problem, but it's not the problem. It's not the only problem, and it's not the central thrust of the report, of a report like this. We really need to anchor our message. Where do we get the maximum number of people acting in a way that is influential? And the super rich are a tiny majority. If we have a lot of energy to spend, we should spend it on getting governments to cut these people off of you know, I'm not going to complete it, but where it comes to public to changes in values, where it comes to changes in consumption that can have sizable impact, it is mostly people like us here in this call, people like us who have more stable jobs in Western societies with salaries that are fairly reasonable. This is where the consumption is fairly impactful. And so we need to start reflecting in where is it that we are also observing sort of difficulties in transitioning, and how can this be reflected in the broader dissemination of messages that we are giving out. So there's quite a lot to be explored here. I'm probably not, I live in a highly consuming society, so I should also shut up. But you know, we've definitely not handled this well. The joke I usually make as part of the reason why we're not handling it well is because we're trying to cushion our own consciences and feel a bit better about our own consumption. So we say, you know, the public can't really handle it. It's for all of us.
So Louis, I would like to make a final comment and question. We talked a lot about the role that SCORI could play. Now, as we all know, SCORI has 1,300 affiliates. It's not a well-focused organization. It's more like a network of researchers and practitioners, all working in the same context that you have been talking about. So we would be interested to hear from you how SCORI could become more effective in not only researching, but also bringing the research results into the realm of policy and practice and action. So maybe a few words from you as a closing.
Thank you, Philip. One of the reasons why I thought I would present this here, of course, it's out of respect for the wonderful colleagues of SCORI that I know that are also doing really wonderful, if not better work out there, and that I've been doing so for a long time. It is also because I recognize that bringing the work here allows me to benefit from experiences that others have, or from projects that others are already are also working on. So what I find and what I think needs to happen over the next few years is really building a large consortia around key themes that need to be driven really hard from different perspectives. And in this respect, lifestyles is one of them. Nature-based solution is going to be another one. We have lots of them that you can start getting into pockets, but lifestyles is clearly one of them. And we're going to have to start building large coalitions around here that do a number of things. One of them is understanding and distilling knowledge on predominant patterns of lifestyles, how they are impacting the climate or the environment, and also how they will be impacted by solutions that are being proposed right now, technology, investments, and so on. The other one is beginning to interpret this in the formats that can be used as or translated into policy messages, designed into practical policy messages. Where should priority be given? We already know that from the work of a few persons. I see Arnold Tucker in the call, for example, who's done a lot of analysis on priority areas where attention should be focused. How should this attention be put? What kind of policies respond or do not respond? And then beginning to look at emerging areas, grassroots ideas, but also budding ideas of knowledge and practice in different corners of the world that fit into a picture of a future 1.5 society, and asking the question of how this can be adopted or replicated or translated into mechanisms of practice for other areas of the world. We also need to start thinking very carefully that a lot of what has been put together so far in this field has been predominantly from Western societies or people trained in Western societies. The science, the understanding, the analysis. There's a whole world, a majority of the world that is not participating in publishing around this field, but that equally have lifestyles or ways of living. There's quite a bit we can learn from them. And in fact, there is need to start building the space for these people to come on board and to at least inform some of the work that we're doing, if not teach us a few lessons and areas of how those of them that have been living well within planetary limits can help us find pathways to the future. So a number of things that I think we can do with SCORI or can be done within SCORI that would be very helpful towards here, or at least in terms of the 1.5. One of the most difficult things is getting data. And we have members from across the world that can easily feed data for different areas of consumption and so on that can be centrally analyzed. So beginning to expand the number of countries and the data points that are collected would serve as a huge resource, not just for this publication, but for lots of policymakers and other researchers that need it, or even universities. So beginning to build this kind of a resource or infrastructure for research and policy would be especially useful. Two, there are a number of us that within SCORI that conduct a lot of research, but are not really good at dissemination. And there are also people that are very good at taking this knowledge or this information and transferring it into knowledge or actionable bits. It would then mean that we start working out relay patterns in which new research that comes out gets handed over to these organizations along with the resources for them to move it forward into the various quarters where it's needed, either policymakers, public domain, civil society organizations, and so on, or even through campaigns. The third part, which I think is extremely important, is beginning to talk about future-oriented perspectives. We don't talk enough about this. We critique a lot of the present, but we don't allow opportunity for understanding what future possibilities are, what it could look like, feel like, smell like, taste like. This is really largely absent. And a combination of knowledge from technology, from lifestyles, from policy design, from futures fields, and socio-technical transitions within SCORA could really help in beginning to articulate different forms of what future societies could take and make it a little less amorphous and scary to everyone who is out there. These are just some of the indicative points that I put out, but I think there's a lot more that can be done on across SCORA. So the way I potentially could imagine it is SCORA being a facilitating platform that brings these different aspects or elements that are complementary to each other to create a combined momentum and to raise the field into areas where it's not, and even make it stronger in areas where it's already percolating.
Thank you, Louis. And I want to thank you for this webinar and for your last comments. I want, from a SCORA perspective, I want to repeat that we have a listserv that is very active in discussing these issues. We are now talking about the next conference in 2023, which will have this future-oriented perspective. We are already working on that. So again, thank you all for your interest and for your questions and comments. And by that, I close this meeting and I see you at the next webinar in December 13. Thank you. And Kat has a final comment.
No, sorry, it was just the applause function. I was just applauding a really good presentation. Sorry.
Thank you.